stock was to consist of 100 shares, Mr. Astor taking 50, the rest being divided among the other partners and their associates. A general meeting was to be held annually at Columbia River, where absent members might vote by proxy. The association was to continue for 20 years, but might be dissolved within the first 5 years if found unprofitable. For these 5 years, Mr. A agreed to bear all the loss that might be incurred. An agent appointed for a like term was to reside at the main establishment, and Mr. Hunt was the first person elected. Mr. Astor determined to begin his enterprise with 2 expeditions, one by the sea the other by land. The former was to carry out everything necessary for the establishment of a fortified post at the mouth of the Columbia. The latter, under the conduct of Mr. Hunt, was to proceed up the Missouri and across the Rocky Mountains to the same point. In the course of this overland journey, the most practicable line of communication would be explored, and the best situations noted for the location of trading rendezvous. Following Mr. Irving, in our brief summary of his narrative, we will now give some account of the first of these expeditions. A ship was provided called the Tonquin, of 290 tons, with 10 guns and 20 men. Lieutenant Jonathan Thorne of the United States Navy, being on leave of absence, received the command. He was a man of courage and had distinguished himself in the Tripolitan War. 4 of these partners went up in the ship: McKay and McDougall, of whom we have already spoken, and Messrs. David and Robert Stewart, new associates in the firm. McDougall was empowered to act as the proxy of Mr. Astor in the absence of Mr. Hunt. 12 clerks were also of the party. These were bound to the service of the company for 5 years and were to receive $100 a year, payable at the expiration of the term, with an annual equipment of clothing to the amount of $40. By promises of further promotion, their interests were identified with those of Mr. Astor. 13 Canadian voyageurs and several artisans completed the ship's company. On the 8th of September, 1810, the Tonquin put to sea. Of her voyage to the mouth of the Columbia, Mr. Irving has given a somewhat ludicrous account. Thorne, the stern, straightforward officer of the Navy, having few ideas beyond those of duty and discipline, and looking with supreme contempt upon the motley quote-unquote lubbers who formed the greater part of his company, is painted with the easy yet spirited pencil of an artist indeed, while McDougall, the shrewd Scotch partner, bustling yet pompous, is impressed with lofty notions of his own importance as proxy for Mr. Astor, and is made supremely ridiculous as possible with as little apparent effort as can well be imagined. The portraits, however, carry upon their faces the evidence of their authenticity. The voyage is prosecuted amid a series of petty quarrels and cross purposes between the captain and his crew, and occasionally between Mr. McKay and Mr. McDougall. The contests between the 2 latter men were brief, it appears, though violent. Within 15 minutes, as Captain Thorne in a letter to Mr. Astor, they will be caressing each other like children. The Tonquin doubled Cape Horn on Christmas Day, arrived at Owyhee on the 11th of February, took on board fresh provisions, sailed again with 12 Sandwich Islanders on the 28th, and on the 22nd of March arrived at the mouth of the Columbia. In seeking a passage across the bar, a boat and 9 men were lost among the breakers. On the way from Owyhee, a violent storm occurred, and the bickering still continued between the partners and the captain, the latter indeed grievously suspecting the former of a design to dispose him. The Columbia, for about 40 miles from the mouth, is strictly speaking an estuary, varying in breadth from 3 to 7 miles and indented by deep bays. Shoals and other obstructions render the navigation dangerous. Leaving this broad portion of the stream and in the progress upward, you find the mouth of the river proper, which is about half a mile wide. The entrance to the estuary from sea is bounded on the south by a long, low, and sandy beach stretching into the ocean, called Point Adams. On the northern side of the Frith is Cape Disappointment, a steep promontory. Immediately east of this cape is Baker's Bay, and within this the Tonquin came to anchor. Jealousy still continued between the captain and the worthy McDougall, who could come to no agreement in regard to the proper location for the contemplated establishment. On April the 5th, without troubling himself further with the opinions of his coadjutors, Mr. Thorne landed in Baker's Bay and began operations. At this summary proceeding, the partners were, of course, in high dudgeon, and when open quarrel seemed likely to ensue, to the serious detriment of the enterprise. These difficulties, however, were at length arranged, and finally on the 12th of April, a settlement was commenced at a point of land called Point George, on the southern shore of the Frith. Here was a good harbor, where vessels and 200 tons might anchor within 50 yards of the shore. In honor of the chief partner, the new post received the title of Astoria. After much delay, the portion of the cargo destined for the post was landed, and the Tonquin left free to proceed on her voyage. She was to coast to the north to trade for peltries at different harbors, and to touch at Astoria on her return in the autumn. Mr. McKay went in her as supercargo, and a Mr. Lewis as a ship's clerk. On the morning of the 5th of June, she stood out to sea, the whole number of persons on board amounting to 23. In one of the outer bays, Captain Thorne procured the services of an Indian named Lamazi, who already made 2 voyages along the coast and who agreed to accompany him as interpreter. In a few days, the ship arrived at Vancouver's Island and came to anchor in the harbor of Nuiti, much against the advice of the Indian who had warned Captain Thorne of the perfidious character of the natives. The result was the merciless butchery of the whole crew, with the exception of the interpreter and Mr. Lewis and the ship's clerk. The latter, finding himself mortally wounded and without companions, blew up the ship and perished with more than 100 of the enemy. Lamazi, getting among the Indians, escaped and was the means of bearing the news of the disaster to Astoria. Relating at length the thrilling details of the catastrophe, Mr. Irving takes account to the comment on the headstrong, though brave and strictly honorable character of Lieutenant Thorne, the danger and folly on the part of agents in disobeying the matured instructions of those who deliberately plan extensive enterprises, such as that of Mr. Astor, is also justly and forcibly shown. The misfortune here spoken of arose altogether from a disregard of Mr. A's often repeated advice to admit but few Indians on board the Tonquin at one time. Her loss was a serious blow to the infant establishment at Astoria. To this post, let us now return. The natives inhabiting the borders of the estuary were divided into 4 tribes, of which the Chinooks were the principal. Comcomly, a one-eyed Indian, was their chief. These tribes resembled each other in nearly every respect and were, no doubt, of a common stock. They lived chiefly by fishing. The Columbia and its tributary streams abounding in fine salmon and a variety of other fish. A trade in peltries, but to no great amount, was immediately commenced and carried on. Much disquiet was occasioned at the post by a rumor among the Indians that 30 white men had appeared on the banks of the Columbia and were building houses at the second rapids. It was feared that these were an advance party of the Northwest Company endeavoring to seize upon the upper parts of the river and thus forestall Mr. Astor in the trading of the surrounding country. Bloody feuds in this case might be anticipated, such as had been prevailed between rival companies in former times. The intelligence of the Indians proved true. The quote-unquote Northwest had erected a trading house on the Spokane River, which falls in the north branch of the Columbia. The Astorians could do little to oppose them in their present reduced state as to numbers. It was resolved, however, to advance a countercheck to the post of the Spokane, and Mr. David Stewart prepared to set out for this purpose with 8 men and a small assortment of goods. On the 15th of July, when this expedition was about to starting, a canoe manned with 9 white men was bearing the English flag entered the harbor. They proved to be the party dispatched by the rival company to anticipate Mr. Astor in the settlement at the mouth of the river. Mr. David Thompson, their leader, announced himself as a partner of the Northwest, but otherwise gave a very peaceable account of himself. It appears, however, from information subsequently derived from other sources, that he had hurried with a desperate haste across the mountains, calling at all Indian villages in his march, presenting them with British flags and proclaiming formally that he had took possession of the country for the Northwest Company in the name of the King of Great Britain. His plan was defeated, it seems, by the desertion of a great portion of his followers, and it was thought probable that he now merely descended the river in a view of reconnoitering. McDougall treated the gentlemen with great kindness and supplied them with goods and provisions for their journey back across the mountains, this much against the wishes of Mr. David Stewart, quote, who did not think the object of their visit entitled them to any favor, unquote. A letter from Mr. Astor was entrusted to Thompson.